So it is 10 o'clock now. I'm going to do my very best to get us done in time for those going to late service. I recognized it's Palm Sunday, and so service is going to go long. But let's go ahead and start with a word of prayer. Gracious Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the opportunity to gather in your name. As we begin the celebration of Holy Week, may you prepare our hearts and minds to more fully know the depth of love that you have for us. You've proven that through the suffering and sacrifice of your Son, Jesus. May your Holy Spirit work in our hearts to draw us closer to you. And it is in the holy and precious name of Jesus that we pray. Amen. Amen. So, this morning I have the privilege of sharing a very difficult and sobering presentation. I tend to be more of a lighthearted guy, and I like to joke, and this is not that presentation. My interest in the crucifixion and the aspects leading to Jesus' death actually came from a patient experience that was about 10 years ago. Some in the late service heard a little bit about that. I'm going to talk about that more later this morning. It's not just an interesting topic, though. This is a critically important topic. Now, the slides here, of course, the animations don't work, so everything's going to come up. I'll do my best. There'll be a little bit of overlap, but let's just start here. So why knowing this is important? It establishes that Jesus actually died. Now, that may not sound like a big deal, but there are about 2 billion Muslims on our planet, and they don't believe Jesus actually died. They think that an imposter was placed on the cross that had the appearance of Jesus, but that God brought Jesus or carried him up to heaven before he was killed. Jesus is a prophet in the Islamic faith, but obviously not the Messiah. You also look at skeptics, atheists. They say, well, Jesus didn't rise from the dead. That's not possible. How can we explain that? Maybe he didn't actually die. So you got to die in order to rise again. This is called the swoon theory. So again, this is the importance. Paul even writes about this in Corinthians. He says that if Jesus hasn't died, if he hasn't been raised from the dead, we're still stuck in our sin, and we're to be pitied more than all men. And so this is a critically important issue for us to show that Jesus actually did die. Secondly, it reveals the depth of Jesus' physical suffering. The more that we understand what he went through, and that's my goal today, is to teach you more about what Jesus went through, that will help us better appreciate just how big that sacrifice was. And as we better understand the depth of the physical suffering, that can give us just a window in to the spiritual suffering that Jesus went through. Lastly, it can provide strength during times of our own suffering. So suffering is not just a theme of life. And every one of you knows experience suffering and haven't, just wait. Jesus says that in this trouble, he tells us that there will be suffering. And so of this that God oftentimes speaks to, and I'm sure many of us could share stories that has worked through suffering in your life. C.S. Lewis, who was no stranger to suffering, his mother died when he was 9. His wife died after 3 years of marriage. He says this in his book, The Problem of Pain. God whispers to us in our pleasures. He speaks in our conscience, but he shouts in our pains. A phone calls a deaf world. I am here this morning to describe to you how God used megaphone, which was his own suffering, and how in his own suffering and death, he showed the depth of his love. Again, about 2,700 years ago, I believe that Isaiah, the book of Isaiah, 700 BC, this oldest known full manuscript copy of the book of Isaiah. It's called the Great Isaiah Scroll. Go online, there's a virtual library, and you can scroll through the actual scroll. It's actually by 1946. You've heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is, and so I have that opened up there to Isaiah 50. Isaiah 53 reads, "He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering, filled with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. He took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was for our iniquities. That punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed." And so our journey will begin in Gethsemane. We're going to look at about the 24 hours, really about the 18 hours of Jesus' death. In trials, we'll see the flogging or the scourging that was done. We'll look at the walk to Golgotha, and then the crucifixion and Jesus' death. So let's start Thursday night of Holy Week, which we'll be celebrating this Thursday. This is now fast forward about 700 years, and Jesus is near the end of his 3-year ministry. Scholars believe this was about the year 30 AD, and it's the beginning of Passover. So remember, Jesus has just given the first communion. He was in the upper room with the disciples, and he gives his kind of parting words. And then he takes the disciples and he takes them over to the Garden of Gethsemane. That is the Garden of Gethsemane, or at least what is believed to be the actual Garden of Gethsemane. And there's olive trees there. That is to the east of Jerusalem. Jerusalem sat on a hill, and then to the east you would go down the Kidron Valley and then up the Mount of Olives. And it's there on the Mount of Olives where Jesus would often go to pray and have his quiet time. You go a little further east and you get to Bethany. A lot of Jesus' ministry was in this area. And I'm sorry, this is the animations here. I apologize for that. But in Luke, it describes, "And he came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives. And the disciples followed him. And when he came to the place, he said to them, 'Pray that you may not enter into temptation.' He withdrew from them, knelt down, and prayed, saying, 'Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done.' And there appeared to him an angel from heaven, strengthening him. And being in agony, he prayed more earnestly. And his sweat became as great drops of blood falling to the ground." And so Luke, who wrote the gospel, was a physician. And so was he speaking metaphorically? And so there's actually a medical condition called hematidrosis or hematohidrosis, which means bloody sweat. And this can happen. It's rare. It usually occurs during times of severe psychosocial, psychological stress, okay? So if you go to PubMed, that is sort of the Google for physicians, scientists, you can go and look up journal articles and research that's been done. And so I just go to PubMed and type this in, and you'll get multiple case reports in the literature that talk about this condition. Again, I apologize with the animations here, but there's 2 individuals there that actually have bloody sweat on their face. And what's described in each of these reports, the consistent factor is that there is severe psychological stress going on. Some of them also have bleeding conditions like hemophilia or something like that. Obviously, we don't know that about Jesus. The pathophysiology or the mechanism for this is not well understood. What we think, and so the slide that you can see here is a hair follicle. At the bottom of each hair follicle is a small set of blood vessels or capillaries. And what's thought is that those capillaries rupture in the midst of this stress, and then the blood pools at the bottom of the hair shaft and then comes out where the hair follicle is. When Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, he says, "My soul is sorrowful to the point of death." And Jesus here, remember, he knows what's going to happen. He's told his disciples, they don't understand, but he knows what's going to happen. Imagine if you knew that you were going to be dying within the next 24 hours, that you were going to be agonizingly tortured, and that you were going to be separated from your Father. That's where he's at this point. And so At this point in the Garden of Gethsemane, then the temple guard, the Jewish temple guard comes and they arrest him, and then they take him to the home of Caiaphas, the high priest at the time. And there, we read in Matthew 26, then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered. Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking false testimony against Jesus that they might put him to death. And it goes on further, and they say, "You have heard his blasphemy. What is your judgment?" They answered, "He deserves death." Then they spit in his face, and they struck him. And some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Christ. Who is it that struck you?" Right away, we find that Jesus' trial violated Jewish law. The Mishnah was the Jewish legal code, and there are actually 4 ways that the code was violated. First, the Jewish criminal court could only be convened during the daytime. Remember, Jesus is in the Garden of Gethsemane, the middle of the night. The disciples are too tired, they fall asleep. This is in the middle of the night that they bring him in front of the Sanhedrin. Okay? Second, that had to be stopped by sundown. Again, it's the middle of the night. Third, it could not occur on the eve of the Sabbath or on the eve of a celebration like the Passover. And then fourth, a guilty verdict could not be reached until at least the day after the trial to ensure that they received a fair trial. And so on all 4 counts, Jesus is already facing injustice. Now, they are convinced of his blasphemy, and we know that they were convinced of his blasphemy beforehand. They were looking for a reason to charge him with this, because with blasphemy, the punishment would be death. He is beaten, he's mocked, they hit him, they spit on him. Now, we don't know to the extent what happened there, but I imagine that that was not a friendly interaction. But they weren't just content with a beating, okay? The origins of crucifixion are not clear. It was thought to have developed by the Assyrians. And with the Assyrians, they had a practice where they would have these long stakes that would shoot up, and they would impale rebels and captured peoples on top of these poles and let them die. And actually, in the book of Esther, we see this precursor. So King Xerxes, the Great of Persia, he had 2 officers impaled on poles. The Persians were really the ones that popularized it. Darius the Great of Persia, he tells of crucifying rebel leaders. And I'm sorry that doesn't show up, but there's actually a place in Iran, it's called the Behistun inscription. It's this carving on the side of a rock face, and it describes his victories, his battles, and there are parts where it talks about them crucifying the captured prisoners and rebels. Now, the Persians had it. It got handed down to Alexander the Great. He brought it to the Mediterranean. He brought it to Carthage. And the Carthaginians were the ones that brought it to the Romans. Now, the Romans, like architecture and like war, they perfected crucifixion. Crucifixion was incredibly well thought out. It was calculated, and it was vicious. Now, both the Romans and Jews agreed that crucifixion was awful. In fact, it was noted to be the summa supplicia, which meant the supreme punishment. There are Roman legal digests that detail that this was the summa supplicia. Number 2 behind crucifixion was being burned alive. Number 3 behind crucifixion was being tied to a post and being eaten alive by wild animals. So crucifixion was considered worse than that. Cicero was the great Roman orator. He said that it was the most cruel and hideous of tortures. Josephus, the great Jewish historian in the 1st century, said that it was the most wretched of deaths. Now, who was eligible for crucifixion? Actually, the Romans considered crucifixion barbaric. and therefore they reserved it for the barbarians. Romans didn't typically crucify Romans, they crucified others. And the others that they would crucify would be the slaves, captured peoples, in order to discourage uprisings. And then it would also be those who had rebelled against the Roman government. And that's because they were trying to do two things. They were trying to torture the individual, and then also to serve as a warning to the rest of them. Don't act like this guy or you're going to have the same fate. The goal was to maximize that torture and humiliation. There's an author who says, it was for those who did not deserve to die with even a shred of dignity. This is actually very important because both the Romans and the Jews agreed that to be crucified was literally to be cursed by God. You were considered outcast from your family, your community, your world, and the hereafter. And so the Jews actually, and in Deuteronomy it said, cursed is he who hangs on a tree. The Romans, their pantheon, they thought all of their gods had rejected you if you were crucified. And what's interesting about this is that if you look in the start of the early church, when news is spreading, Jesus' resurrection, Jesus is the Messiah, the big contention that the Jews had at the time, there's no way he could be the Messiah because he was crucified. And we know that if you're crucified, you're cursed by God. So back to the Jewish trial. So Jewish law excluded crucifixion as a form of capital punishment. You could do these other nice things. You could stone them, you could burn them, you could behead them, you could strangle them. That was more humane than crucifixion. And so, while each of these would be grotesque, painful, humiliating, crucifixion maximized all three. So, what do? They decide, if we can't crucify him, we need to get somebody who will. And that was the Romans. Now, permission for crucifixion had to come from the Romans, and that was Pontius Pilate at the time. So they brought Jesus to Pontius Pilate, and let's see, did that? Oh, I'm sorry. That Luke, let's look at that. Luke 23, it says, they brought him before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, we found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar. He is saying that he himself is Christ, a king. And so you can see that the leaders, even though the reason they want to kill him is blasphemy, to the Romans they tell him he's trying to cause an insurrection. He's a rebel. He's saying he's the king. He's trying to replace Caesar. So Pilate hears this, and then there's some politicking that goes on between Pilate and whose jurisdiction it is. He's sent over to King Herod Antipas. This is the son of King Herod who killed the children when Jesus was born. They fled to Egypt. So this is his son. He gets kicked back to Pontius Pilate, and Pilate employs the governor's right of coercitio. Coercitio was where we get the term coercion, to force someone to do something. And this was a right that a governor had, that they could enforce a punishment without a formal legal trial. Another example of injustice. And so Jesus was not a Roman. Roman citizens were excluded from coercitio. And so this could be a beating. This could be put in prison, where you would be there until you could pay money. That's in other parts of history too, debtor's prison. You could be flogged or scourged, and you could be summarily executed. And so at this point, Pilate, in order to satiate the Jewish leaders, says, all right, I will take him to be scourged or flogged. So let's take a look here at Jesus' baseline medical condition. So before the Garden of Gethsemane, remember, he was an itinerant preacher. He traveled by foot, got a lot of walking in. He was probably in pretty good health. He was in his early 30s. Those days seem so nice. From Thursday night to Friday morning. Now, he's been in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's been taken by the Jewish leaders. He's been beaten, mocked, he's been up all night, so he's under severe emotional stress, so much agony that he's bleeding, sweat, okay? He has had his friends abandon him, he's been physically beaten, he hasn't slept, and he's been forced to walk several miles in all of this. Remember, he was outside the city, he's gone back into the city, he's taken from Caiaphas' house, then to in front of the Sanhedrin, then he's taken to he's taken to Pontius Pilate, then he's taken to King Herod, and then he's taken back to Pontius Pilate, okay? So before the flogging, he's under severe psychological stress. He's got early signs of dehydration and exhaustion. And now the flogging. Flogging was considered a legal preliminary to crucifixion. To crucifixion. It excluded women and Roman senators. The instrument that was used was this nasty little whip called a flagrum. And you can kind of see that there on the picture. This was a braided leather cord. And at the end of that flagrum would be two things. There'd be little metal balls that would be on it, and then there would be sharp pieces of bone. This was a viciously clever design. It was taking advantage of the physiological effects of both what we as physicians call blunt trauma and penetrating trauma. It was taking both. Next to being crucified, this was one of the most feared forms of Roman punishment. So, when hit with the flagrum, so Jesus would have been tied to a post, and if some of you have seen The Passion of the Christ with Mel Gibson, he does a good job of depicting this. So they would be tied to the post, and then you would have two soldiers, one on each side, and they would go back and forth and whip him. They each had a flagrum, and they would continue to whip him, okay? As they were doing that, it would cause Jesus' skin and soft tissues to be torn. Think about when you prepare a chicken, what do? You tenderize it. Those metal balls are tenderizing Jesus' flesh, and then they're being torn by the bones. Deuteronomy 25, there were rules about this. It says, if the guilty man deserves to be beaten, the judge shall cause him to lie down and be beaten in his presence with a number of stripes in proportion to his offense. 40 stripes may be given, but not more, lest if one should go on to beat him with more stripes than these, your brother be degraded in your sight. And so this was the tradition of the 39 and 1, Jesus receiving the 39 and 1. And the reason they did that is because you didn't want to accidentally miscount and do 41, because that would be an abomination to God. Question, is Deuteronomy a book on Roman corporal punishment? No. So it's a mistake to believe that Jesus got a 39 and 1. We don't know how many we got. Guaranteed he got more than 39 and 1. Much more than 39 and 1. Now, the severity of the scourging would be dependent on the disposition of the Roman soldiers, but these guys, their job, the purpose of the scourging, was to beat someone up until the point of death and right before that, okay? So a good soldier would be able to get right up to that line. It was considered a faux pas if you accidentally killed him. You went a little bit too far and killed him. Then they couldn't be crucified. Now, the scourging would cause a tremendous amount of pain. The repeated lashes would go deeper and deeper into the flesh. Let's go through those different layers. Now, I'm showing you a picture of the back. Jesus was not just scourged, whipped on his back. He was probably done from the neck all the way down to the calf muscles. His entire backside was torn. But in the interest of this discussion, we'll just focus on the back. So as he is beginning to be hit, they're going to start going through the skin and what's called the subcutaneous tissue, the fat layer, okay? If you've ever had a cut, you know it bleeds and it stings. So now Jesus is going to start bleeding. He's going to start having significant pain with these. Pretty soon they're going to get to what's called the superficial muscle layer. And these are the muscles, at least in the back, that are involved with movement of the extremities, the arm, the shoulder girdle, your latissimus muscles, and then as you go lower, your gluteus, your hamstrings. Now, as they're continuing to whip him, it's going to start to tear through that muscle. He's going to have accelerated bleeding and hemorrhage. So it doesn't show up well, but right in the midline is the spine, and right adjacent to those are what are called the thoracolumbar artery perforators. And those are the blood vessels that come up and feed that tissue. And so as he's being whipped, those vessels are being torn, and now he's going to start having more hemorrhage, more blood loss. There are also nerves that come out from there that give all of the feeling on your skin. Those nerves are now being torn and shredded. Dr. William Edwards, in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 1986, said, as the flogging continued, the lacerations would tear into the underlying skeletal muscles and produce quivering ribbons of bleeding flesh. By this point now, as the flogging is continuing, they're getting to what's called the posterior thoracic wall. This is the deepest layer in the back. And at this point, those balls are hitting into the rib cage. Those bones are tearing into the intercostal muscles between those ribs. So now Jesus is getting rib fractures. Now those muscles are being torn, and those are the muscles that assist in breathing. The superficial muscles are not allowing him to move his arms. The deep penetration is now impairing his ability to breathe. There are also blood vessels and nerves that go along that area. They actually go, of course, along with the ribs. As it's bleeding, he's not just bleeding and losing blood. That bleeding is now going into his thoracic cavity where his heart and lungs are. And that's going to become important later. Eusebius in the 3rd century, the great, really the first Christian historian, he says, the sufferer's veins were laid bare. The very muscles, sinews, and bowels of the victim were open to exposure. If they whipped around too far, they would tear open and intestines would fall out. Also on the backside, as you get below the rib cage, as they're hitting there, you're going to start to get into the kidneys. You're going to get into the pancreas. These are called the retroperitoneal organs. And then, if you go much deeper than that, you're going to get into the descending aorta, and you're going to get into the inferior vena cava. That line probably got crossed if they tore into the aorta or the IVC, the vena cava. So Jesus has now been scourged, and he is taken back. It says in Matthew 27, the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the governor's quarters, and they gathered the whole battalion before him. They stripped him, they put a scarlet robe on him, and twisted together a crown of thorns. They put it on his head and put a reed in his right hand. And kneeling before him, they mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they spit on him. They took the reed and they struck him on the head. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes on him and led him away to crucify him. There are several candidates for the crown of thorns. The Sarcopterium spinosum and the Euphorbia milli are those two, and I'm sorry about that, that's small there. Trust me, the thorns are big. Those are the two thorny plants that are native to that area in Palestine and are thought to be the leading candidates, okay? In this, I want you to imagine the crown of thorns being placed on Jesus' scalp. If you rub your hands on your scalp, it feels good, right? You get a scalp massage. Imagine thorns going into that scalp. There's a lot of nerves and blood flow in the scalp. And now this crown of thorns is placed on his head. And then, remember, it says they spit on him, they took the reed, and they struck him on the head. Now I want you to imagine, like a hammer, they're hammering those thorns into his skull. Now, the Romans had no custom for releasing a prisoner like this, but the Jews had a custom of releasing a prisoner at Passover. Pilate is trying to be diplomatic here. You could give a whole talk on the politics of the crucifixion. But at this point, he has said 3 times, I find this man not to be guilty, to be innocent. And he kind of struggles on what he should do. He's trying to walk a line. He basically wants to tell the Jewish leaders, look what I've done. I've scourged him. I've done what you've asked. But there's also huge crowds for Passover. Hundreds of thousands are there, and many of them would be people that had followed Jesus in his ministry, that were followers. And so Pilate is looking at the possibility of a riot if he goes and kills this guy, and he's already beaten him like what they want. So what does he do? He comes up with an idea. Hey, you guys have a custom of releasing a prisoner for the Sabbath. How about I release Jesus? Okay? But what happens? The Jewish leaders whip up the crowd, and the crowd says, no, we want Barabbas. Barabbas was like the token other option that Pilate may not necessarily have been expecting that they would pick. They pick Barabbas. So Pilate then renders a punishment of crucifixion. He attempts to absolve himself of responsibility. I don't think he did, but he attempts to absolve himself of responsibility, and now Jesus is now led to be crucified. So let's take a look here. This was surprising to me as I looked into this to realize before Jesus is crucified, where is he at from a medical standpoint? So before the scourging, after the Garden of Gethsemane, severe psychological stress, exhaustion, early dehydration. But now after the scourging, he is in intense agony, severe pain. He's got early to the mid stages of hemorrhagic shock. He's bleeding out. He has difficulty breathing because of those broken ribs and torn intercostal muscles. He has difficulty moving his arms because his shoulder girdle and the back muscles have been torn. He has difficulty with standing or walking. His gluteus and hamstrings have been torn. He probably has had a concussion. He was beaten on the head by the Jewish leaders in the beginning. He was beaten with the rod by the Roman soldiers as well. So at this point, before Jesus has been crucified, he is in serious condition. That means his vitals are unstable. He's got a very elevated heart rate. His blood pressure is going down. He's getting hypotensive. His ability to provide blood flow to his organs is being compromised. At this point, he is seriously ill, and he would be admitted to our intensive care unit, requiring intense monitoring and intervention in order to prevent death. John 19:17 says, "And Jesus went out, bearing his own cross, to the place called the place of a skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha." Now, it was customary for the victim to carry their own cross. Now, you may have seen the street preacher that carries the big, T-shaped cross, that sort of thing. That's not what actually happened. What would happen is it would be the horizontal crossbar. That's called the patibulum. So Jesus' arms would have been tied to that patibulum, and it weighed about 70 to 100 pounds, and it was not sanded with 400 grit sandpaper. And imagine that 70 to 100 pounds as he is walking, and every step that he takes, 70 to 100 pounds is pushing in to his mutilated flesh. He was escorted by a complete Roman military guard. Their job, 1, 2, and 3, to ensure death. And it was actually at the threat of their own deaths. If somebody happened to survive, that puts them at risk of being executed. Matthew 27:32, as they went out, they found a man of Cyrene, Simon by name. They compelled this man to carry his cross. What does Simon's role imply about Jesus' medical condition?
He was unable to carry it.
He was in bad shape. And as I talked about earlier about how they wanted to get as close as possible to the point of death, it's this fact that gives indirect evidence that they were pretty close. Most people could have carried that cross, so maybe they were here. Jesus was here. Now, Jesus arrived at Golgotha. There would be standard preparations by Roman law. The victim would be given wine and gall. Then they would secure the hands to the patibulum, the horizontal crossbeam. Usually that would be by nails. And then once they had him nailed to the crossbar, they would lift him up onto the cross, the vertical beam, okay? For you do-it-yourselfers, think about a mortise and tenon joint. It would be something like that, okay? Once he was on the cross, Then the feet would be secured, okay? And then at that point, crucified criminals, they were mocked by the soldiers, and then there would people passersby. Remember, this is a public spectacle, usually along the roads coming into the city. People would come by and they would mock them, they would spit on them. His garments would then be divided among the soldiers. That wasn't just for Jesus. That was considered one of the perks or bonuses of being one of these soldiers, is that you get the clothing afterwards. So Jesus is now put on the cross, and then the patibulum, his arms are stretched out, and his hands would have been nailed. Now, this is where I live as a hand surgeon, okay? With the nailing, so it was thought that, did the Romans tie him or did they nail him? So when we look after Jesus' resurrection, indirect evidence, we look at doubting Thomas. And remember, Jesus goes to Thomas and he says, look at my hands, put your finger here, believe, right? So this suggests that Jesus was in fact nailed. That picture in the middle is actually the first direct archaeological evidence of Roman crucifixion with nails. That was found in 1968. And then the far right, that is a still image from the movie The Passion of the Christ by Mel Gibson. And this is when Jesus is about to be nailed. Mel Gibson himself was a practicing Catholic, and Mel Gibson, as the director of the movie, insisted that's his hand. Mel Gibson insisted that it be his hand that put the nails into the cross because he felt like it was his sin that put Jesus on the cross. So, this is what interests me here, is where the nails were put. So, traditionally it's thought it goes into his palms here, okay? In the palm, which is the kind of the blue circle there, that would go between the bones, the metacarpals of the hand, into what's called the interosseous muscles. It's also been argued that maybe it was just to the right of there between the thumb and index finger, which are the thenar muscles. That is unlikely. And the reason that's unlikely is because there's not sufficient support there to hold the weight of the criminal there. That nail would tear out through. Now, there's a ligament there called the intermetacarpal ligament, but it's not sturdy enough to hold the weight. Hard to do scientific experiments on that. Where are you going to find volunteers? So it is much more likely where that red dot is, that's where he was crucified, and that's actually at his wrist. And the Greek word for hand is the same for wrist, okay? So right there in that spot would be between the radius and the ulna, and that radius, which is the bone on the right of that red circle, would be on top and would be able to support the weight, okay? That spot, remember I said the Romans were calculated and vicious with crucifixion. That spot is the one spot where the median nerve goes into the hand and supplies the sensation to the majority of the hand. I'm sure some of you have had carpal tunnel syndrome, talk to me later, but that's the nerve that's affected, okay? Is the nail goes directly into that nerve. These nails were not your typical birdhouse brad nails. These were 7-inch railroad spikes, okay? And when those would be driven in, they would go directly into that nerve. Now, the pain that Jesus would have experienced, this is what got me interested in learning more about the crucifixion. It was a patient experience that I had 10 years ago. So, I didn't put the actual picture up here. Laura, my wife, encouraged me not to put the real picture of this gentleman's hand, so I just put in the x-ray. This is an x-ray that was taken between 4 and 24 hours after my patient cut off his hand, okay? And the reason I say between 4 and 24 hours is not because it was 10 years ago and I forgot, but it's because the patient didn't know. The patient was acutely psychotic, and he was suffering from a condition called apotemnophilia. That's our word for the day, apotemnophilia. And that is a condition where you are convinced that one of your extremities is not yours. This hand is not my hand. Get it off of me. And so in a moment of acute psychosis, my patient cut off his own hand. He used a steak knife, and when he cut through the skin. He cut through the 2 major arteries that Dan uses for an art line. He cut through 22 tendons. He cut through 4 bones. You ever taken a turkey leg off, you tear it at the joint? He did not cut through the joint. He cut through the bone. The x-ray doesn't quite show that that hand is not connected to his arm. There was only one thing, it was dangling by a thread, that hand kept it connected to the arm. That was the median nerve. And so what's interesting about some of these psychiatric patients is you can be very honest in your questions with them. And so before I took him back to the operating room for 9 hours of surgery, I asked him very straightforwardly, why didn't you cut that thing right there, knowing what it was? And his answer to me was, Doc, it hurt too much. And so, the one spot that hurt too much for him to chisel the rest of his hand off is the one spot where the nails went into Jesus. Now, Jesus is now up on the cross. Let's get back to the crucifixion. There were different designs of the cross. Typically, we think of the standard Latin cross, the lowercase t. There would also be the tau cross, which is the uppercase t. They would have a titulus above, and that basically described what was the crime that they committed for them to be crucified. They wanted onlookers to see why they're being crucified. Sometimes they would have a little seat right in the middle, it's kind of hard to see, called the sedile. That was a seat. That was not the Romans being gracious. That was a way to prolong crucifixion, because then they could sit there, take longer, allow time for predatory animals to come up and eat them alive. Sometimes that seat would have a spike on it. I'll let you figure that one out. So once Jesus is on the cross, his feet are going to be nailed, okay? They would either be nailed in front of the beam, side by side, or they would be split and be on either side of the vertical beam, okay? That was called the stipes. Those nails would go through one of two spots, and both of those spots have the nerves running through them. So another nail, another nerve. There would be different variations in the way they would be crucified. We don't know exactly the way in which Jesus was crucified, but Seneca in the 1st century said, I see crosses there, not just of one kind, but made in many different ways. Some have their victims with their head down to the ground. Some impale their private parts. Others stretch out their arms. Josephus said, the soldiers out of wrath and hatred they bore the Jews nailed those they caught to the crosses in different positions by way of jest. Now there would be remaining preparations for crucifixion. Luke 23 describes this, so that titulus would be put up there. Again, this is some great politics on Pilate's part. Jesus' titulus, the title says, King of the Jews. What's interesting is that Pilate was not happy with the Jewish leaders, and he felt forced into that position of crucifying him. So how does he get him back? He says that the crime is being King of the Jews. And remember the reasons for crucifixion for Romans: insurrection, rebelling against the government. He doesn't put that on there. He puts King of the Jews. And what do the Jews tell him, the leaders? Hey, no. He claimed to be the King of the Jews. And what does Pilate say? What I have written, I have written. It's kind of his last way to get him back, okay? The soldiers cast lots for his robe. They mock Jesus. Everyone gets in on that, including the neighboring criminal, one of the criminals. So I want you to take a step back and realize what happened to this point when you think of the injustice that Jesus has endured and the pain that Jesus has endured and how he responds. In Luke 23, Jesus says, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. At this point, at the beginning of the crucifixion, He would have continued severe pain from the open wounds and the nerve injuries. Now that he's up there, his back and entire backside is being rubbed up against that wood. Every time he's trying to breathe, it's moving against that wood. He's having continued hemorrhage, worsening dehydration. He's having worsening shock. He's got impaired breathing. Remember, he can't breathe because of the broken ribs, the bleeding into the thoracic cavity. He's got impaired shoulder function and obviously severe psychological distress. At this point, he would be described as in critical condition. So not only is he in the ICU, now his vitals are so deranged that it's not clear that he would even survive at all, even with medical intervention. Now, the physiological alterations that happen during crucifixion, first, cramping. This they have done studies on. There were volunteers that they would tie just with straps to a rudimentary cross, and they bend the legs, because that's how they would be fixed with the legs bent, and then they would see how they did. And what they found is within 15 minutes, you would start to get severe cramps. Think about if you've had to change a light bulb and it's not going right, or doing something overhead. 5 minutes, your arm is killing you. So you would have severe cramping. What they found in these subjects is that within 45 minutes, none of them could continue. They had to be taken down. You would have excruciating pain, and the word excruciating literally means out of the cross. That's where we get that term, because of the pain that Jesus would have been enduring. And then again, we talked about his respiratory function, and let's go a little bit more into that. Breathing during a crucifixion, there are some different theories on this. The most popular one is that you're up there and your arms are stretched out. And think about if you stretch your arms out as far as you can, you take a deep breath in and you can kind of get a little further. So as he's being held on the cross, his chest is actually expanded with a breath that's like stuck in. And so the difficulty is not breathing in, the difficulty is breathing out. And for him to breathe out, he has to pull himself up to let the air come out. What is he pulling against? Shredded muscles, all the way on the backside. And what's in his wrists and what's in his feet when he's doing that? He's pulling against those nerves. Dr. Truman Davis said, "As the arms fatigue, great waves of cramps sweep over the muscles, knotting them in deep, relentless, throbbing pain. With these cramps comes the inability to push himself upward. Hanging by his arms, the pectoral muscles are paralyzed. The intercostal muscles are unable to act. Air can be drawn into the lungs, but cannot be exhaled." So at this point, Jesus is bleeding to death. He doesn't have enough blood volume to perfuse or give oxygen to the tissues. He can't breathe in and get the oxygen in. He can't get the carbon dioxide out. And so the high carbon dioxide, the low oxygen leads to loss of consciousness. At this point, voluntary breathing ceases, and not soon after that, involuntary breathing ceases. And then he dies. It was now about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour, while the sun's light failed. The curtain of the temple was torn in two, and then Jesus, calling out with a loud voice, says, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And then he breathed his last. There is insufficient evidence to say exactly what caused his death. It was likely multifactorial, and the two biggest being the blood loss and the inability to breathe and exchange gases, carbon dioxide and oxygen. The length of survival when one was being crucified was somewhere between 3 hours and 3 days. Jesus was on the shorter end, which is consistent with what we know about his flogging. Death would be hastened by breaking the legs below the knees. This is called crurifragium. This was the Romans actually adapting a bit to the Jews. In the areas where the Jews lived, they would take the crucified victims down from the cross before sunset and allow them to be buried. Delayed death, you didn't necessarily want that, because then you've got those predatory animals that then would eat you. These crosses were not 20 feet in the air. They were about anywhere from 10 inches to 36 inches off the ground. So Roman law allowed the family to take down the body for burial, and Joseph of Arimathea goes to Pilate and requests that he take Jesus' body down. The Jews used to take so much care of the burial of men that they took down those that were condemned and crucified and buried them before the going down of the sun. Now, the body would not be released until death was confirmed. Remember, those soldiers, if they didn't ensure death, it was their death. And so they would break the legs if they could tell they weren't dead yet. But then once they thought they were dead, they would pierce them in the side with a lancia, or a lance, okay? John 19 says, when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once there came out blood and water. Now, the blood and water typically is not in the lungs. And so how do we explain that? Remember, I was talking to you about those rib fractures and the blood coming into the thoracic cavity. So that alone would have put that fluid in there. But why water? If you look and put blood in a test tube and you leave it standing straight up for long enough, what happens? It separates out, and you get the serum, the kind of clear yellow part, and then you got the red blood cell concentrate at the bottom. And so one theory is that when he was speared, that the layers of blood in his thoracic cavity had separated out, and that's what came out. So I'm just going to close here in the last couple minutes, putting it all together. Jesus suffered one of history's most humiliating and excruciating forms of capital punishment. There is no question that he died, and he likely died as a combination of hemorrhagic shock and asphyxia, respiratory failure. Matthew 27 says, now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? And so everything that I've described this morning about the physical suffering is minutia compared to the spiritual suffering, the weight of our sin, and the tearing apart, the separation of the Trinity. Okay, I can't go to that slide because of the animation. There's a word on there called tetelestai. In the first century, we have records, and a lot of the early writings and things that you see in history, cuneiform writing, parchments, were either religious documents or they were stories of conquering rebels and how great a king you were, or they were financial transactions. And with financial transactions in the first century, if you had, you bought a piece of land and you had a debt obligation. When that debt obligation was fulfilled, they would put on the top of that parchment one word, tetelestai. Okay? It meant that the debt was paid, that it was finished. Before Jesus dies, a single word falls from his lips. And that is the only place in the entire Bible where that word is used. After this, Jesus, knowing that all was finished, said to fulfill the scripture, I thirst. A jar full of sour wine stood there, so they put a sponge full of the sour wine on a hyssop branch and held it to his mouth. When Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, it is finished, tetelestai. He bowed his head and he gave up his spirit. Jesus was not saying, it is finished, I'm dead. He was saying, the debt is paid. My favorite verse in the Bible is Romans 5:8. Romans 5:5-8 says, you see, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person someone might possibly dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us. That happened at about 3 p.m. Jesus is outside the city being crucified and breathes his last. At that moment, inside the city of Jerusalem, remember it's the Passover. And what happened at 3 p.m. at the Passover? The temple priest would blow the shofar, the trumpet, and the beginning of the sacrifice would happen. The lambs, the unblemished lambs, would come up and be sacrificed to atone for the sins of the people. At the exact moment that that is starting, the final perfect sacrificial lamb is saying outside that city, "It is finished." This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. Amen.
The thing that you didn't mention was he never cried out during his scourging.
No,
That
they don't
is
record it.
impossible for any human.
Yeah. We've got about 5 minutes until late service. I'd be happy to stay after if there are any questions, but I want folks